Something wiped out an entire civilization in a single moment. And for thousands of years, no one could explain how. No craters, no lava, no signs of war. Just cities abandoned mid-action. Tools left where they fell. Crops unharvested. And a layer of rock melted at temperatures so extreme that even modern science struggles to reproduce them. Today, beneath the surface of southern Turkey, scientists are uncovering evidence that doesn't fit any known natural disaster. And the deeper they dig, the more it begins to look like this wasn't an accident at all. If you're interested in ancient mysteries, hidden technologies, and discoveries that challenge everything we think we know about history, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what you're about to hear only gets more disturbing. In 1963, farmers near a small village in Turkey began uncovering something strange while digging their land. At first glance, it looked like ordinary stone. But when geologists examined it, they realized this wasn't natural rock formation. It was melted, completely fused, as if exposed to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. That alone raised questions. But the real problem was this. There were no volcanoes anywhere near the region, not within hundreds of kilometers. And there was no impact crater, no evidence of a meteor strike. Yet the stone had clearly been liquefied. Decades later, in 2008, a German geologist reanalyzed samples from the same region. What he found expanded the mystery dramatically. This wasn't an isolated patch of melted rock. It was part of a continuous glass-like layer stretching across nearly 80 kilometers of land, a layer that shouldn't exist. In geology, formations like this, called tektites, typically form after massive meteor impacts. The heat from the collision melts surface material, scattering it over large distances. But in this case, all the expected signs were missing. No iridium traces, no shockwave deformation in surrounding rock, no crater. The meteorite explanation didn't work, so scientists turned to dating the layer. And what they found changed everything. Approximately 10,000 BC, right at the moment when several early human cultures in the region vanished without transition. No gradual decline, no signs of migration. Entire settlements simply stopped existing within what appears to be a very short time span. Homes were left intact. Tools remained in place. Even food was left behind. It looked less like abandonment and more like interruption. At first, researchers tried to explain it through climate shifts or unknown regional disasters. But none of those theories could account for the temperatures required to melt stone at that scale, or the precision of the affected areas. Because this destruction wasn't random, it was localized, focused, almost directional. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because when scientists began comparing these findings with ancient records, texts that had long been dismissed as mythology, they found something they weren't expecting. Descriptions, not of natural disasters, but of weapons. The first time researchers seriously compared these findings with ancient texts, it was almost dismissed immediately. The idea sounded too far-fetched, too convenient. Ancient civilizations describing advanced weapons? That belonged in fiction, not science. But the problem was this. The descriptions didn't read like mythology. They read like observation. Sumerian tablets, some of the oldest written records humanity has, contain repeated references to a time before recorded history. a period they described as the Age of the Anunnaki, beings who, according to the texts, came from the heavens to the earth. For decades, historians treated these passages as symbolic, religious metaphors, cultural storytelling, until specific lines started matching physical evidence. One of the most cited texts, known as the Sumerian King List, contains a passage that stood out once researchers looked at it through a different lens. It describes a moment when the gods used weapons brighter than 1,000 suns against the rebellious cities. At first glance, poetic language. But then came the second layer of comparison. In another text, the Atrahasis epic, the destruction is described in more detail. The sky above a city is said to have ignited, not burned gradually, ignited, followed by complete erasure. No survivors, no remains, not even dust left behind. For a long time, these were just stories, until archaeologists started digging in places like Eridu. Eridu is considered one of the oldest known cities in human history. Located in modern-day Iraq, it has been studied for decades. But in 2014, a new excavation revealed something beneath its cultural layers that didn't fit the timeline. A 5-meter thick layer of fused material, not burned clay, not ash, but sand that had been exposed to such extreme heat that it had partially turned into glass. The composition was immediately analyzed, and what scientists found was disturbing. The material closely matched Libyan desert glass, a substance known to form either from meteorite impacts or extremely high-energy thermal events. But again, the same problem appeared. No crater, no impact evidence, and most importantly, the dating. Around 10,000 BC, exactly the same period as the melted layer found in Anatolia. 2 separate regions, same time frame, same type of thermal anomaly. No natural explanation. At this point, researchers started to notice a pattern, not just in the materials, but in the consistency of the destruction. Because it wasn't chaotic. It wasn't what you'd expect from a random disaster. It looked controlled. In Turkey, the melted layer stretched across a defined region. In Eridu, the fused sand was concentrated beneath a specific cultural layer, as if something had affected the area from above, briefly but intensely. A pulse, not a prolonged event. And then the third anomaly appeared. At a site known as Sayonu, one of the earliest Neolithic settlements in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists uncovered something even harder to explain. Inside one of the structures, beneath what appeared to be a ritual space, they found a thick layer of ash, about 20 centimeters deep. At first, that didn't seem unusual. Fires were common in ancient settlements. But laboratory analysis told a different story. The ash wasn't normal combustion residue. Each particle showed signs of having been exposed to extreme heat, then cooled almost instantly. This kind of structure doesn't occur in typical fires. It doesn't occur in wildfires. It doesn't occur in volcanic activity. It can only be reproduced under highly controlled conditions, using directed energy, something like a concentrated thermal pulse. And within that ash, scientists detected trace elements that shouldn't have been there in those concentrations. Bismuth, iridium, osmium. Elements often associated with extraterrestrial material or advanced metallurgy. Now the pattern was impossible to ignore. Multiple locations, same time period, identical thermal signatures, and destruction that behaved less like nature and more like a system. But the most unsettling part wasn't the evidence itself. It was what happened when scientists tried to explain it. Because every natural explanation failed. And that left only one category no one wanted to touch. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. By the time multiple sites began showing identical patterns of extreme thermal destruction, the scientific community found itself in a difficult position. The data was real. The measurements were verified. But the explanation didn't exist. So researchers did what science always does under pressure. They looked deeper. And that's when attention shifted to a place that had already challenged everything we thought we knew about early civilization. Göbekli Tepe, discovered in the 1990s in southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe is considered the oldest monumental structure on Earth. Its massive stone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, were carved and arranged with precision at a time when humans were supposedly still primitive hunter-gatherers. It shouldn't exist. At least, not according to the traditional timeline of human development. But the real anomaly wasn't just its age. It was what happened to it. Around 10,000 BC, the exact same period as the melted layers and vanished settlements, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned, buried, and not in a chaotic way. Not as a result of collapse or natural sediment. Every layer of soil was placed carefully, sequentially, methodically. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision, and it took years. Whoever built Göbekli Tepe didn't run from something. They took the time to hide it. That alone would be strange enough. But when archaeologists began studying the stone pillars more closely, they found something even harder to ignore. On several of the limestone columns, there were signs of intense heat exposure, but not evenly distributed. Only one side of the pillars showed melting. The opposite side remained completely intact. That detail changed everything, because natural heat sources, fires, lava, explosions, don't behave like that. They spread. They dissipate. They affect surfaces irregularly. But this looked directional, as if the heat had come from a single point, from one side, like a beam. The implications were immediate and uncomfortable. Because if the heat was directional, then it wasn't random. And if it wasn't random, then it was controlled. At first, many researchers tried to downplay the significance. The data was often excluded from official reports or labeled as secondary observations. But not everyone ignored it. Klaus Schmidt, the lead archaeologist who worked on Göbekli Tepe for over 2 decades, became convinced that the burial of the site wasn't about destruction. It was preservation. Something inside the complex mattered enough to be hidden deliberately, protected, and possibly sealed. After Schmidt's death in 2014, excavations slowed. Access to certain deeper layers became restricted. Officially, it was for conservation reasons. Unofficially, things became quieter, less transparent. Then, in 2019, something happened that almost no one outside a small circle of researchers was supposed to know. During extended excavation work beneath the main complex, a chamber was discovered, roughly 3 by 4 meters, lined with polished limestone. And inside that chamber, there were 3 objects. 2 of them were familiar. Ritual vessels. Objects already known to archaeology. But the third one didn't match anything. It wasn't stone, it wasn't clay, and it wasn't anything that should have existed in that time period, because it looked manufactured, deliberately shaped, precisely finished. A cylindrical object, about 70 centimeters long, and covered, completely covered, in symbols. Symbols that looked almost like Sumerian cuneiform, but not quite. And that's where the story stops being just about ancient history. Because what happened next wasn't scientific curiosity. It was silence. There was no press release, no official mention in excavation summaries, no catalog entry. The third object from the chamber beneath Göbekli Tepe simply didn't exist, at least on paper. The official report listed only 2 ritual vessels, nothing more. But information like that doesn't stay hidden forever. 3 months after the discovery, a French archaeologist who had been part of the excavation team published several photographs on his personal blog. No announcement, no explanation, just images and a short description. Within days, his contract was terminated. The blog was deleted, but not before the images were downloaded. What those images showed changed the direction of the entire investigation. The object was cylindrical, approximately 70 centimeters in length. Its surface was smooth, too smooth. Not carved, not chipped, not shaped using primitive tools. It looked machined, precisely finished in a way that stone tools simply cannot achieve. And then there were the symbols. They resembled Sumerian cuneiform, but they weren't identical. Some matched known characters. Others didn't exist in any recorded language. That detail alone caught the attention of linguists. One of them, a German Orientalist, managed to analyze the symbols using the leaked photographs before they disappeared from circulation. He identified several repeating signs. The first translated roughly to sky, the second, Lord, and the third didn't have a direct modern equivalent. But in older Sumerian dictionaries, it was associated with a phrase that meant fire directed downward. That same combination of symbols appears in ancient Mesopotamian texts, specifically in passages describing the tools used by the Anunnaki. Not tools of construction, not tools of agriculture. Weapons. At this point, the connection was impossible to ignore. A cylindrical object, portable, covered in symbols referring to the sky, a ruling force, and directed fire, and located at a site already linked to a massive, unexplained thermal event. But things didn't stop there, because around the same time, another piece of data surfaced, this time from satellite imaging. In 2021, a geological survey using advanced scanning methods revealed something unusual beneath the Anatolian Plateau. Patterns, not random formations, not geological fractures. Lines, perfectly straight lines, radiating outward from a single central point, the region of Göbekli Tepe. 8 of them, each extending for tens of kilometers, each ending in an area where melted rock layers had been recorded. 8 lines, 8 impact zones. Perfect symmetry. This kind of geometry doesn't occur naturally. It doesn't form through erosion. It doesn't result from tectonic movement. It requires precision and intent. If Göbekli Tepe was placed at the center of those lines, then the implications were clear. It wasn't just a ceremonial site. It was a point of origin. And whatever happened there didn't spread randomly across the land. It was directed, controlled, targeted. Each zone showed evidence of extreme heat exposure within a radius of several kilometers. Enough to melt surface rock, enough to erase settlements, enough to end entire communities instantly. 12 known settlements existed within that radius during the same time period. All 12 disappeared. No signs of war, no signs of migration, no evidence of disease. Just absence, as if something had removed them from the timeline. And now, with the artifact, the symbols, and the geometric pattern aligning, the question was no longer whether something happened. It was what. And more importantly, how. Because whatever caused this wasn't just powerful, it was repeatable. And that meant one thing. It wasn't an event. It was a system. If it was a system, then it had to leave more traces. And it did. But not where researchers expected. Instead of massive destruction sites or obvious technological remains, the next clues appeared in something far more subtle and far more disturbing. Ash. Not ordinary ash. Not the kind left behind by fire or combustion. But something that, under a microscope, behaved in a way that shouldn't be possible outside controlled laboratory conditions. The first detailed analysis came from samples collected at the Sayo New site. Scientists expected to find organic residue, burned wood, plant material, maybe traces of domestic activity. Instead, what they found was structurally different. Each microscopic particle of ash had a thin outer shell that had been melted and then instantly cooled. Not gradually. Instantly. This kind of formation requires exposure to extreme temperatures, followed by rapid thermal drop-off, something that doesn't happen in natural fires. Even volcanic eruptions don't produce this structure consistently. To replicate it, you need a controlled, high-energy pulse. Something directed. Something precise. And then came the chemical composition. Within the ash, researchers detected elevated levels of rare elements: bismuth, osmium, iridium. Elements that are extremely dense, highly resistant to heat, and rarely found together in natural surface deposits. Their presence raised immediate questions. Because while iridium is sometimes associated with meteor impacts, the pattern here didn't match impact debris. The distribution was too uniform, too localized. And once again, there was no crater, no shockwave signature, no debris field, which meant the source of heat wasn't external in the traditional sense. It wasn't something that hit the Earth. It was something that acted on it. And this wasn't an isolated case. In the late 1990s, a Swiss geochemist conducted a large-scale comparative study across multiple archaeological sites in the Middle East. He analyzed samples from over 20 locations, all dated between 12,000 and 10,000 BC. 17 of those sites showed the exact same anomaly. The same type of ash, the same particle structure, the same unusual element composition. 17 different locations, spread across hundreds of kilometers, all within a defined radius centered around the Anatolian region. At this point, coincidence was no longer a valid explanation. This was pattern, and patterns require a source. But the most alarming discovery didn't come from geology. It came from genetics. In 2022, an international team of researchers analyzed DNA from ancient human remains across the same regions. What they found was something known as a population bottleneck, a sharp and sudden reduction in genetic diversity, but not gradual, not over centuries, within a very short time frame. The data suggested that the population in the region dropped by nearly 70%. 70%. Not from slow decline, from something catastrophic. And when researchers compared the timeline of this genetic collapse with the geological data, it matched perfectly. Same period, same regions, same boundaries. The areas with melted rock layers and anomalous ash were the same areas where human populations suddenly disappeared. Not migrated, not adapted, vanished. Which raised a question that no one in the scientific community was comfortable answering. What kind of event can melt stone across vast regions, leave behind controlled thermal signatures, produce non-natural ash structures, and reduce a population by 70% in a matter of generations, without leaving behind any known evidence of natural disaster? Because by now, every conventional explanation had been tested, and every one of them had failed. Volcanoes couldn't explain the precision. Meteorites couldn't explain the absence of impact evidence. Climate couldn't explain the heat. And human technology at that time simply didn't exist. Which leaves only one possibility. Something was there. Something capable of generating energy levels comparable to modern thermonuclear events, but without radiation, without fallout, without any trace that fits into our current understanding of physics. And if that wasn't unsettling enough, there was evidence suggesting that whatever caused this didn't just happen once. At first, researchers tried to treat each anomaly as an isolated case. A strange ash layer here, a melted surface there, and an unexplained collapse somewhere else. But as more data accumulated, a pattern began to emerge, not just across geography, but across time. Because the same type of destruction appeared again, thousands of years later, in a completely different era. In a place known today as Tal el-Hammam, located in modern-day Jordan, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a catastrophic event that occurred around 3600 BC. What they found looked familiar. Too familiar. Pottery shards had been partially melted. Mud brick walls had turned into glass-like material. Metal objects showed signs of having been exposed to temperatures so high that some of them had vaporized. The estimated heat? Over 2,000 degrees Celsius, exactly the same threshold observed in the Anatolian sites. Once again, the initial explanation pointed toward a meteor airburst, something like what happened in Tunguska in 1908. But when scientists analyzed the evidence more closely, the same problems appeared. No crater, no clear impact signature, no consistent shockwave pattern, and more importantly, the distribution of damage didn't match an explosion. It wasn't radial, it wasn't chaotic, it was uneven, selective, as if the energy had been directed toward specific zones, which raised a question no one could ignore anymore. Was this the same phenomenon, or something repeating itself? Because when researchers compared the destruction patterns between Anatolia, 10,000 BC, and Tal el-Hammam, 3,600 BC, the similarities were too precise to dismiss. Same thermal intensity, same material transformations, same absence of natural causes, separated by over 6,000 years. If this was natural, it should behave consistently. If it was random, it shouldn't repeat this way. But this wasn't either. It was consistent and selective. And that's when some researchers began revisiting the ancient texts, not as mythology, but as records. Because in Sumerian writings, the use of these so-called weapons from the sky wasn't described as a single event. It was described as something used more than once. One term appears repeatedly across multiple tablets. Sharur, often translated loosely as a divine weapon, but the original context is more specific. Shurur is described as something that can be carried, something that can be directed, something that responds. In some passages, it is even described as communicating with its wielder, not symbolically, functionally. And in 17 recorded instances, Shurur is used in direct association with destruction from above, fire, heat, annihilation. Not storms, not earthquakes. Fire. Directed. Which brings us back to the object found beneath Göbekli Tepe. A cylinder. Portable. Covered in symbols that reference the sky, authority, and downward fire. The parallels are difficult to ignore. But the deeper researchers went into these texts, the more unsettling the descriptions became. Because the Anunnaki, the beings associated with these weapons, weren't described as abstract gods. They were described as physical. They ate, they rested, they argued, they governed, they mined resources, they built structures. And according to the texts, they managed humans. Not spiritually, practically, as a workforce. The word Anunnaki itself is often translated as those who came from heaven to earth. Not deities in the symbolic sense, but entities with origin, function, and presence. And here's where things take another turn. Because descriptions of these beings, found not only in Sumerian texts, but in Egyptian, Vedic, and even Mesoamerican sources, share similar characteristics. Tall, elongated skulls, eyes described as luminous or star-like. For a long time, these similarities were dismissed as coincidence, cultural overlap, parallel myth-making, until physical evidence started appearing. Skulls, real ones, with features that didn't match standard human anatomy. And when those skulls were analyzed, they didn't behave like human remains should. Because if the texts were right about the beings, and the artifacts were real, then the question is no longer whether something happened. It's whether we're looking at the remains of something that wasn't entirely human. The discovery of elongated skulls didn't start in one place. They appeared across multiple continents: Peru, Egypt, Anatolia. At first, archaeologists believed they were the result of cranial deformation, a known cultural practice where skulls are intentionally shaped during infancy using bindings. But that explanation began to fall apart under closer analysis, because these skulls weren't just elongated. They were different, structurally. When anthropologists examined them in detail, they found something unexpected. The number of cranial plates didn't match standard human anatomy. The bone density was different. The internal volume of the skull, where the brain would be, was significantly larger. In some cases, up to 25 to 30% greater than an average human skull. That alone raised questions. But the real anomaly came from genetic analysis. In 2020, a group of researchers conducted DNA testing on several elongated skulls found in Peru. The results were never officially published in full, but parts of the data were leaked. According to those leaks, the mitochondrial DNA extracted from the samples did not match any known human haplogroup. Not a mutation. Not a variation. Not something that could be traced back through standard evolutionary lines. Something unclassified. There was no official confirmation, but there was also no denial. And that silence started to look familiar. Because by now, a pattern had formed, not just in the data, but in how the data was handled. Researchers publishing unusual findings lost funding. Articles disappeared. access to sites became restricted. Information didn't get disproven. It just stopped moving. The same thing happened with the artifact from Göbekli Tepe. After the initial leak, independent analysis became almost impossible. The original object was no longer accessible. Only images remained, and even those were difficult to find. But one of the most important breakthroughs came from a material scientist who decided to analyze those images in a different way. Instead of focusing on the symbols, he studied the surface. Using high-resolution spectral analysis techniques, he attempted to estimate the composition of the material based on how it reflected light. What he found shouldn't have been possible. The outer layer of the object appeared to be made from an alloy containing osmium, iridium, and rhenium, three of the densest and most heat-resistant metals known, all of them extremely rare, all of them difficult to work with, even using modern technology. And more importantly, they are not found together in natural alloys. Creating a stable combination of those elements requires advanced metallurgical processes that humanity only began to understand in the 20th century. Yet this object was dated to around 10,000 BC. That contradiction alone should have triggered global attention, but instead, the analysis disappeared. The publication was removed. No explanation, no follow-up, just silence. But even without official confirmation, the implications were clear. An object made from materials capable of withstanding temperatures above 3,000 degrees Celsius, found in a location where surrounding stone had been melted at around 2,000 degrees, suggests one thing. It wasn't affected by the event. It was designed to survive it, which leads to an unavoidable conclusion. The object wasn't a victim of the destruction. It was part of it. And if that's true, then the next question becomes much more dangerous. Because it's not about what this device was. It's about what it could do, and whether it still can. Because if something like this existed once, and was powerful enough to erase entire regions, then the only thing more concerning than its past is its present location. The question of where the artifact is now doesn't have an official answer. But unofficially, it does. According to multiple independent leaks, the object recovered from beneath Göbekli Tepe was transferred to a restricted storage facility inside the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara. Not displayed. Not cataloged publicly. Stored under an inventory number that doesn't correspond to any known classification. In other words, it exists, but not for everyone. Attempts to verify this information have led nowhere. Journalists who tried to investigate received warnings. Requests for access were denied without explanation. Even academic institutions that previously worked on Göbekli Tepe were quietly cut off from deeper excavation levels years before the discovery became public. This wasn't random, it was controlled. And the control extended beyond archaeology. Because around the same time, physicists began asking a different kind of question. Not what the device was made of, but how it could work. One of the key problems in understanding the events around 10,000 BC is energy. The level of heat required to melt stone across multiple regions is enormous, on the scale of thermonuclear reactions. But there's a contradiction. There's no radiation, no isotopic traces, no nuclear signature of any kind, which means the energy source, whatever it was, wasn't chemical, and not nuclear. So what's left? electromagnetism. In 2023, a theoretical physicist published a paper exploring the possibility of generating a directed thermal effect using resonant electromagnetic amplification. The idea was complex, but the conclusion was simple. Under the right conditions, it is theoretically possible to focus energy into a beam capable of heating material to extreme temperatures without producing radiation. No explosion, no fallout, just heat. Directed. Controlled. But the most important detail wasn't the mechanism. It was the energy source. According to the model, such a device wouldn't require fuel in the traditional sense. It could draw energy directly from the Earth's geomagnetic field. The same field that surrounds the planet. The same field that protects us from solar radiation. And here's where things become even more unsettling. Because geological data confirms that around 10,000 BC, the Earth's magnetic field was significantly stronger than it is today. Roughly twice as strong, which means a device designed to operate using that field would have been far more powerful back then, and possibly far less effective now. That could explain something. Why the destruction stopped. Why there are no known events of the same scale after a certain point. Not because the technology disappeared, but because the environment changed. The power source weakened. And if that's true, then hiding the device wouldn't just be about secrecy. It would be about waiting. Waiting for conditions to return. Because the Earth's magnetic field isn't constant. It fluctuates. It shifts. And in recent decades, scientists have recorded something unusual. The magnetic poles are moving faster than expected. The field strength is changing. In some regions, weakening. In others, briefly increasing. Temporary anomalies. Short bursts. Localized intensifications. Nothing dramatic. Yet. But enough to raise questions. Because if a device like this depends on the geomagnetic field, then even a small increase in field strength could matter. And that brings us to something that happened recently. Something that, on its own, might not seem important. But in this context, changes everything. In November 2023, something happened at Göbekli Tepe that never made it into official reports. No announcements, no scheduled excavations. The site was supposed to be inactive, but local residents noticed movement. Late at night, a convoy of unmarked trucks entered the restricted area. No logos, no identification, just vehicles moving under low light conditions, escorted and silent. They didn't arrive during the day. They didn't want to be seen. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, the unloading continued until early morning, around 4 a.m. Equipment was brought in, but not the kind used for standard archaeological work. No brushes, no surface tools, heavy machinery, and more importantly, drilling equipment. Not horizontal excavation, vertical drilling, deep. The activity lasted several nights. Then it stopped. The trucks left. But the site didn't return to normal. Because after that, something changed. Security increased, significantly. A perimeter was established far beyond the official excavation zone. Armed guards remained on site, rotating shifts, maintaining constant presence. No explanation. When journalists asked questions, the response was simple. Routine soil stabilization. But soil stabilization doesn't require night operations, doesn't require multiple unmarked vehicles, and it doesn't require vertical drilling into untouched sections of the site. Then came the satellite data. Independent researchers analyzing images from late 2023 identified disturbances in an area that had never been officially excavated, the northeastern sector of the complex. The patterns suggested subsurface activity, not surface-level work, something deeper. And then a thermal anomaly appeared, a localized heat signature beneath the ground, larger than the chamber discovered in 2019, much larger. At this point, the situation stopped looking like archaeology and started looking like retrieval. Because if the chamber found at 8 meters depth contained one object, then what was below it? That question became even more serious when an Iraqi archaeologist published a translation of an ancient tablet, one that had been discovered decades earlier, but never fully interpreted. The text described a location, not by name, but by geography. A place with circular stone structures, a central hill, multiple enclosures. The description matched Göbekli Tepe, but the most important part wasn't the location. It was what the text said about what was beneath it. According to the translation, the site was not just a ceremonial complex. It was a repository, a storage system, containing something referred to as the weapons of heaven. And these weren't scattered. They were organized in levels. 7 of them. 7 underground layers, each containing devices of increasing power. The one discovered in 2019, the cylindrical object, was not the primary one. It was described as a second-level device, which means there are at least 5 levels below it, possibly more. The 7th level, according to the text, contains what is called the main Sharur, the highest tier device, the one described not as a weapon of cities, but of the entire Earth. At first, this translation was ignored. Then something unusual happened. Instead of academic debate, there was a response. Not from a university, not from a research institute, but from a government entity. The Turkish embassy contacted the archaeologist directly, requesting access to the original tablet, all research materials, all notes. He refused, and shortly after that, he removed himself from public discussion. Now, combine that with the drilling, the increased security, the thermal anomaly, and the fact that access to deeper levels has been restricted for years. It starts to form a picture, not of discovery, but of controlled excavation, targeted, specific, and focused on something very particular. Because if the artifact found at 8 meters is only level 2, then the drilling isn't random. It has a direction. Down. And that leads to a question no one is asking publicly. What exactly are they trying to reach? And more importantly, what happens if they do? By early 2024, the situation had moved far beyond speculation. Too many independent signals were pointing in the same direction. Geology, archaeology, physics, ancient texts, and now, modern activity. In March 2024, a geophysical monitoring station in Norway recorded something unusual over the Anatolian Plateau. A localized geomagnetic anomaly. Not global, not regional. A concentrated Euselenia pola, about 7% above normal levels. Duration, approximately 40 minutes. No seismic activity. No solar storm. No atmospheric disturbance. Nothing that could explain it. Just a sudden, isolated increase in magnetic field strength, centered almost exactly over the Göbekli Tepe region. On its own, that might not seem significant. Geomagnetic fluctuations happen. But this one was different because of timing. It occurred just months after the Nochny Borowy Roboty, just months after equipment was brought into a restricted zone, just months after a previously untouched sector showed signs of deep subsurface activity. And if the theoretical models are even partially correct, then a localized increase in geomagnetic field strength could temporarily activate or amplify a device designed to use that field as an energy source. No one officially made that connection, but privately, some researchers did. At the same time, a group of scientists from multiple countries submitted a formal request to UNESCO. Their demand was simple: an independent international investigation into the anomalies in Anatolia. They didn't mention Anunnaki. They didn't mention weapons. Only data. Melted layers, geometric patterns, unexplained thermal signatures, population collapse, satellite anomalies. 37 scientific papers were cited. Satellite imagery included. Laboratory results attached. The response? A standard acknowledgement. The request has been accepted for consideration. No commission was created. No investigation launched. No follow-up. And then came something even more telling. The people involved in pushing for transparency began to disappear. Not physically, but professionally. Funding delayed. Projects paused. Access revoked. Public statements avoided. The pattern repeated. Across countries. Across institutions. Different systems. Same result. Information slowed. Then stopped. At this point, the question is no longer whether the data exists. It does. The question is, why is it being contained? Because suppression requires coordination, and coordination implies awareness. Someone knows. Not everything, but enough. Enough to restrict access. Enough to control the narrative. Enough to make sure certain connections are never discussed openly. Now look at the full picture. A 10,000-year-old thermal event with no natural explanation. A geometric destruction pattern centered on a single location. An artifact made of materials beyond ancient capability. Ancient texts describing a portable directed weapon. Evidence of repeated use across millennia. A buried structure hiding something beneath it. Modern drilling operations targeting deeper levels. A sudden geomagnetic anomaly directly above the site. Individually, each of these can be questioned. Together, they form something else. A system. Not just ancient. Not just theoretical. But potentially still relevant. Because if the device depends on the Earth's magnetic field, and that field is changing, then the only real question left is not about the past. It's about timing. Because whatever is buried beneath Göbekli Tepe has already been found once. And now, someone is trying to reach it again. For thousands of years, this story didn't exist. Not in history books, not in scientific consensus, not in public awareness. It was buried. Literally. Beneath layers of earth. Beneath structures older than written language. Beneath assumptions about what humanity was capable of at the very beginning of its timeline. But now the fragments are surfacing. Not as a single discovery, as a pattern. A pattern that doesn't ask to be believed. It demands to be explained. Because if we follow the evidence, not the interpretations, not the theories, but the raw data, it leads to a conclusion that is difficult to avoid. Around 10,000 BC, Something happened that does not fit into any known natural process. Not a meteorite, not a volcanic eruption, not climate change. A directed event. High energy, precise, capable of melting stone across vast regions without leaving radiation, capable of collapsing entire populations within a short time span, and centered on a single point. Göbekli Tepe. At that same location, a structure was not destroyed, but buried, carefully, deliberately, as if what was inside needed to be hidden, preserved, sealed away. Thousands of years passed, civilizations rose, records were written. And in those records, the same elements appear again and again. Beings who came from the sky, devices that produced fire from above, weapons that could be carried, directed, activated. Then, in modern times, we find a chamber beneath that same site, an object that should not exist, materials that shouldn't be possible for its time, symbols that reference exactly what the texts describe, and no official acknowledgement. Then, restricted access, suppressed data, removed publications, and recently, activity, unannounced, undocumented, but observed, drilling, deeper than before, into layers that were never meant to be reached casually. At the same time, a geomagnetic anomaly appears directly above the site. Short, localized, unexplained. Exactly the kind of fluctuation that, according to theoretical models, could influence a device dependent on the Earth's magnetic field. No one has confirmed a connection, but no one has explained the anomaly either. And that's the final point. This isn't about proving a theory. It's about recognizing a gap. A gap between what we observe and what we can explain. Because right now, the evidence suggests three things. First, the technology described in ancient texts may not have been symbolic. Second, something matching that description may have already been found. And third, whatever is beneath Göbekli Tepe has not been fully uncovered yet. 7 levels, according to the translation. 7 layers, each more powerful than the last. The object discovered at 8 meters was only the second, which means the majority of the system, if the text is accurate, is still underground. And now, with modern equipment, someone is going down. Carefully, quietly, without public oversight, without explanation. The original question was simple. What destroyed entire civilizations 12,000 years ago? Now the question is different, because the past is no longer the only concern. If something like this existed once, and if it was hidden, not lost, then its story didn't end. It paused. And if the conditions that once powered it are beginning to change again, then the real question isn't what it was. It's who finds it first, and what they choose to do with it.